All right, let's go ahead and get started today. We're finishing up with the Pre-Reformation period, looking at Christian practice. We will finish up today, and then Tuesday a week, we'll look towards the Reformation, kind of summing up where we are, looking at where Christian history is headed, and then 2 weeks from today, we'll review for the final, get all that preparation. Don't forget the Rule of Faith essay before Thanksgiving break, and then the summaries and the last primary source essay after Thanksgiving break. So make sure to keep up with those, complete all those, and get them turned in. Study guide for the final is on Blackboard. If you have any questions, please let me know. Much like what we were talking about with doctrine, many of the things we can see in practice we've already talked about or hinted at, just seeing more fully. One of those is the continued development of mysticism. As we talked about in the last time we talked about Christian practice, mysticism in some sense had been around for quite a while, but it's in the Middle Ages that it really takes on form. You see broader participation in it, and that continues into the Pre-Reformation period as well. Now, sometimes the claims made by mystics led them to being charged as heretics. One group of women mystics, known as the Beguines, for example, in the 12th century, were charged with heresy because they claimed they were striving for perfection through union with God. Once this union was achieved, they claimed, other good works and observation of the sacraments, other religious rituals would be unnecessary. They additionally claimed that this perfection or this union would free them from the church hierarchy and make them separate from that. And so this was considered to be a very heretical position for a variety of reasons, and the Beguines were persecuted by the church hierarchy, including some of them being burned or drowned. Another one of those particular individuals that got into trouble with the church hierarchy, who does have some influence beyond just his lifetime, was Eckhart von Hochheim, who's better known as Meister Eckhart. Meister simply means like maestro or master or maestro. The idea being that he's someone who has great skill related to mystics. He was born sometime between 1250 and 1260 in Germany, and we will know very little about his life. It's only through his writings that much is known, especially about his early life. Eventually, he became a Dominican and studied at Cologne in Germany, what will become Germany, and then also perhaps Paris. He will eventually become a teacher, a lecturer on the sentences by Peter Lombard, one of the scholastic thinkers we didn't really talk about. But eventually he will become a leader of several convents in the region of Saxony, only to go back to teaching in Paris again. Now, it's not so much his teaching as his mystical approach that leads to him becoming remembered. Unlike the scholastics of the time, instead of following Aristotle, Eckhart was a Neoplatonist, and so a lot of the things a lot of the ways that he thought about how the world worked were through the Neoplatonic philosophy. When it comes to mysticism, Eckhart encouraged contemplation of the divine. The focus should be to think about, meditate on God, but God is a being who is too great to be described in words. So you have to know him intuitively rather than intellectually. Because any of the words we try to use to describe God are limited by human language. They are inexact. And because they are inexact, they are strictly speaking false for Eckhart. And so to describe God in words, even if what we might say would be positive about God, is in a sense false because it is not the complete truth. So for example, he said, if I say God is good, that is not true. I am good, God is not. Now you might say, well, wait a second. Now he doesn't mean that God is evil by saying something like that. Instead, he's trying to say that all language, human language we try to use, is comparative. We can only make comparisons to God. And so by its inexact nature, we cannot fully use words to describe God. No human concept that we might have can grasp the fullness of the divine. So true knowledge of God is intuitive, not rational. But you can see how saying things like, if I say God is good, that is not true, might get him in trouble. That means to say that God is not good, immediately people are going to be suspicious, even though it might be, okay, I can see what you're saying if you explain it that way. Probably still not the best way to say it, and if you're reading somebody's works where they're not able to sit there and explain it to you, you can see how it could become a problem. For Eckhart, God is not known by the reason. In many respects, this later form of mysticism is a reaction against scholasticism, that it had become too intellectual in its discussion of God. And so Eckhart emphasized mystical contemplation as the way to know God, rather than a sort of reason or rational approach. Ultimately, we should have the desire to be lost in the divine. And he would go so far as to claim that the soul is actually a spark of the divine. And now, that kind of language is bordering on Gnosticism a little bit, because the Gnostics said something similar. The goal of human life, or human experience for Eckhart, is to enter the soul by withdrawing from material things and ideas. You are turning inward. And this will restore your relationship with God. And again, another controversial statement, you actually become God. There is a deification that takes place. Now again, inexact comparative. It doesn't mean that you become divine, but this union that will take place. Now, based on some of these comments, of course, some nobles especially begin to question his orthodoxy, and he's brought before the Inquisition, claims his innocence. We don't have the exact records, but evidently he is found guilty, and so he appeals to the Pope. The Pope at the time is Pope John XXII in Avignon, and so he gets involved in this, investigates Eckhart's claims, but ultimately Eckhart will die before the determination he was guilty of heresy. Pope John will eventually claim that Eckhart had recanted before his death of his false teaching and submitted to the papacy. Ultimately, though, several of his ideas are condemned. But it's interesting in how it is worded, in that his ideas are condemned, yet Eckhart himself is not. Now, usually it was if somebody was teaching false teaching, like John Wycliffe or Jan Hus, they're condemned as well. Sometimes while they're alive, sometimes posthumously. In this case, there's this very careful wording that's used to condemn his ideas, but not him. So he's never excommunicated or officially declared a heretic. As I mentioned before, mysticism became a way for females to exert some authority and leadership in the church hierarchy, and that is the case of Julian of Norwich. Now, yes, it's Julian. She's named after Saint Julian, so even though it might look like a male name, like Julian the Apostate, this is a woman mystic, but she was a monastic as well. And is representative of how some mystics were very highly respected. Some were condemned because of some of the things they said. Others were respected. We don't know what Julian's birth name was. She was an anchorite monastic, so kind of lived by herself, and lived near the Church of St. Julian in the city of Norwich, which is in England, and that's where she ends up getting the name Julian of Norwich. Not much is known about her life. She may have decided to become a monastic due to the plague, which had gone through Norwich, and so that might have been a reason why she ultimately decides to separate herself from society. At the age of 30, while still apparently living at home, she becomes very sick, to the point that her family and others expected her to die, and so a priest is brought in to administer last rites to prepare for death. As part of that ritual, the priest would hold a crucifix near the person that was receiving the last rites. Crucifixes are different than crosses in that it has a figure of Jesus on the cross. So a crucifix would actually have a figure of Jesus on it. And while she's kind of passing in and out of consciousness, she sees the figure of Jesus on this crucifix start to bleed. For the next day, she will have 15 visions, or will claim that she had 15 visions of Christ and Mary, all starting with this bleeding crucifix. Now, given how bad her health had been, she quite understandably doubts the experience. But the next night, she receives another vision that effectively communicates to her or convinces her that she had seen these visions and that they were true. Unlike other mystics who will have visions throughout their lives, Julian only has visions on those 2 days and then nothing else the rest of her life. And it's that which leads her to spend the rest of her life meditating on these visions. She will write a book or work known as Showings, or sometimes it's referred to as Revelations of Divine Love, which are essentially a recounting of these visions as well as her contemplation of them. Important because of the visions, certainly, but also because this is the first book by a woman in the English language. And so essentially she contemplates these visions and God's love in connection with all the things that are taking place during her life. The plague, the religious schism that's taking place, uprisings, war. But despite all the problems and terrors of contemporary society, she speaks rather optimistically. There's a shorter version that's originally published, and then later it will be revised and expanded. Additionally, one of the things that she introduces into all of this is she tended to speak about God and His love in terms of motherly love. And so instead of a father loving his children, it focuses on a mother, which is not that unusual. You go back through the prophets, you can see God talking about His love for Israel in terms of a mother's love for children. Jesus talks about how He would like to gather the children of Jerusalem like a hen would gather her chicks. So it's not completely new to talk about mother love in the context of God. But essentially in her writings, she compares Jesus to a mother, essentially kind of the mother of the Trinity almost, in her 14th vision. And so her focus on her visions, her contemplation of that becomes rather popular. People are interested in it and read the writings she has. Even more prominent and influential is the visions and the writings of a woman named Catherine, born to a very large family in the city of Siena in Italy. Prior to Catherine's birth, her mother had had 22 children already, but half of them had died. And in fact, Catherine was born as a twin, and her sister died very shortly after birth. The family was lower middle class, and at a very early age, though, this religious interest or religious involvement took place. Supposedly she received her first vision of Christ around the age of 5 or 6. By the age of 7, she vowed to give her life to God. When her older sister died in childbirth, the 16-year-old Catherine was encouraged by her family to marry the widower, her brother-in-law. She refused to do so because she had committed herself to Christ. She cut her hair, she engaged in fasting, all to try and convince her parents not to force marriage on her, which is successful. She ultimately decides to affiliate with the Dominican order. We talked about the Dominicans in the later Reformation period. She doesn't take the vows, and so she never fully becomes part of the order, but she does affiliate with them. It's sometimes referred to as the third order of Dominicans, with the first order being the priests, second order being nuns, and then others who are kind of connected with the order who will participate in the good works. Some of the other fasts that don't take the good works, the other practices, but don't take the vows per se. She does, however, even though she's staying at home, try to live a rather anchorite lifestyle. She's living separate from the rest of her family and will eventually leave as well. She begins to have more visions at the age of 21, including claiming that she had been involved in a mystical marriage to Jesus. That Jesus had become her husband, become her spouse, which was, again, a further kind of separation from marriage. She will continue to have additional visions over the next 3 years. And although she had started off with a kind of anchorite lifestyle, trying to live separate from the world, she eventually will become more active in the town of Siena, helping the sick and the poor. Essentially, this is due to some visions that she had that kind of encouraged her to be back involved in the rest of society, including one that was of hell, purgatory, and heaven.
It sounds like it's really much content. Did these people practice taking medicinal herbs or drugs?
Now, I mean, in some cases, like with Julian, if we were trying to find some sort of reductive psychological experience, you might say, well, maybe it was something with her health. But it does not appear that that was the case for everybody. Other questions? So here she is. She's decided that, well, of course, the visions have led her to be more active in society, helping the poor, etc. Well, she evidently was a very charismatic person as well, and so there are followers that begin to form around her. Especially as she goes throughout Italy, pushing for reform in the church, especially among the clergy. And here again, the mystic now becoming kind of an authority figure by trying to push for reform, which is successful in some places on an individual level. She does convince some priests to change their ways. She has some influence sometimes on larger groups. But eventually she switches to writing letters as well, and not just traveling. These letters would go to a very diverse group of people, including princes and nobles, and even the Pope, who at the time is still in Avignon. She encouraged Gregory XI, who was Pope, one of the last popes at Avignon, before the Great Schism, to leave the city, writing, "Answer the summons of God, possess the place of the glorious Peter, whose vicar you are." Right? Get back home and run where you belong, is essentially what she's telling him, which he does. I mean, it takes him 2 years, but essentially it becomes clear that this is because here's this female mystic who tells him the right place for you is in Rome. So here's this authoritative nature, right? She has no authority because of the hierarchy of the church, but the mystical visions give her some experiential authority that convinces even the Pope. Various representatives of various popes will seek her advice and accept it sometimes, not all the time, but sometimes. In the year 1375, she's moved from visions to what's known as the stigmata. Stigmata are representations of the wounds of Christ, whether that's around the forehead, marks from the crown of thorns, wounds in the side, or the feet, or in the wrists or the hands, the places where Jesus would have been nailed. But Francis of Assisi is said to have had these. There are others throughout history that are said to have had these. For Catherine, she will claim that she prayed that they would not appear outwardly to people. And so it's just kind of her story that she had received. In some ways, we might think, how does this, how would people look at this woman? Seems like they look at him pretty positively. Well, that's not always the case. She does have several enemies because of the political influence that she gets, and there are a few of them that try to have her killed. They do not succeed. When the Great Western Schism happens, she sides with Urban VI in Rome, and she will move to Rome and continue her work with the poor and sick, while also encouraging people, a variety of princes, others, to support reunification under Urban. She is declared a saint in 1461. This is several years after her death. And then in 1970, she will be declared a doctor of the church, along with Teresa of Avila, who is actually more in the 16th century, who was also a woman mystic. They are the first women doctors of the church. Others had always been men. As with most people, in order to become a saint, you have to have miracles attributed to you, either during your life or after death. People might have prayed to you and some sort of miracle takes place. Some of those are rather interesting. According to legend, the people of Siena, after Catherine's death, wanted to have her body, but they knew they couldn't sneak it out of Rome. So they took her head and put it in a bag. They were stopped by some Roman guards wanting to know what they're carrying, and so they pray to St. Catherine, they pray to Catherine, who's not a saint at the time, and when they open the bag, there is no head, only rose petals. They're allowed the path, they eventually get back into Siena, they open it again, and there's the head. So, rather interesting types of miracles associated with some of those people.